Gumba Malgan Gumba Nanigi, which is good evening. It's good to see you here in Burragum, the Aboriginal language of the community that I grew up on the Darling Downs. I'm Vicky McDonald, State Librarian and CEO. On behalf of my colleagues, I welcome you to this event as part of the Conversation series for 2020. I begin by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their continuing connection to land and as custodians of stories for millennia. Here at State Library, we are inspired by this tradition in our work to share and preserve Queensland's memory for future generations. I'd also like to welcome our panellists, Kate Darian-Smith, Executive Dean and Pro Vice-Chancellor, College of Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania, Kate Fullagar, Associate Professor of Modern History at Macquarie University, Alison Page, descendant of the Walbanga and Wadi Wadi people of the Yuin Nation, award-winning creative and adjunct Associate Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and our facilitator, Paul Barclay, Walkley Award-winning journalist and broadcaster, presenter of Big Ideas on ABC Radio National, and our partner, The Conversation. Thank you for joining us for the start of this special partnership with The Conversation. The event brings together subject matter experts from universities and research institutions from across the country to discuss, challenge and reflect on the issues that concern us. Our new partner provides a free, fact-based news source written by academics and edited by journalists, and we look forward to hosting these considered and thought-provoking discussions. We start the series with one of the most pivotal and increasingly polarising figures in the nation's history, Captain James Cook. 2020 marks the 250th anniversary of the Endeavour's journey along the east coast of Australia, part of Cook's first Pacific voyage. In tonight's conversation, panellists discuss that voyage and examine the story of Cook and his interactions with Indigenous peoples, whether the reenactment of the Endeavour's voyage has perpetuated myths surrounding Australia's discovery. Speakers at our events hold a wide range of views and come from diverse backgrounds, and I'm sure that there will be differing views among those watching. I encourage everyone to contribute to the debate respectfully. And you can learn more about the Endeavour's voyage through State Library's vast collection. On our website, you can watch a video of Harold Ludwig from the James Cook Museum, sharing the shore-to-ship account of the Guuga Yimithirr people's interactions with Cook and the Endeavour crew in 1770. And don't forget to explore State Library's Spoken exhibition, celebrating Queensland's languages with our virtual self-guided tour. You can also visit the Conversation's website to read essays by the panellists. Thank you, and please enjoy the conversation discussion.
Hello and welcome to the State Library of Queensland. I'm Paul Barclay from ABC Radio National's Big Ideas program. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we are broadcasting today, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. 250 years ago, British explorer and naval captain James Cook arrived in Australia as part of his first Pacific voyage. He and his crew from the Endeavour first made landfall on the 29th of April 1770 at a place he named Botany Bay. It was here that Cook had first contact with Indigenous people of the area, the Guigal, and the rest, as they say, is history. But just how much of the true history of this event and its aftermath we've been taught and understand, or indeed care about today, remains, of course, a moot point. Still, it's difficult to dispute that Cook's arrival here 250 years ago was a significant event, or that the anniversary provides an opportunity to examine what happened after that fateful day. Today I'm joined by a terrific panel of speakers to discuss some of the aspects of the story of Cook, his explorations of Australia, his interaction with Indigenous people, and how we have historically commemorated his landfall in Botany Bay. The conversation today is jointly presented by the State Library of Queensland and the Conversation website. Our speakers are Kate Fullagar, Associate Professor of Modern History at Macquarie University and author of The Warrior, The Voyager and The Artist, 3 Lives in an Age of Empire. Alison Page is an award-winning creative at the forefront of contemporary Australian Aboriginal design and storytelling. She's a descendant of the Walbanga and Wadi Wadi people of the Yuin Nation, and she's Honorary Professor in the School of Design at UTS. And Kate Darian-Smith is a cultural and social historian of Australian history. She's the Executive Dean and Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the College of the Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania. And welcome to you all. Alison, I thought I'd come to you first of all. You're an Indigenous woman, and I understand you grew up around the Botany Bay area, that part of Australia where Cook first stepped ashore. What's foremost in your mind at this moment as we look back on 250 years?
Wow, I was sort of actually looking forward to this year, which was slightly hampered by a particular virus that I won't mention. But what I was excited about, Paul, was just Australia having the opportunity to learn its true history, because really, to be honest, I think we've been ripped off. It's sort of like, I think there's been a lot of shame around, the origins of our modern nation. And I really don't think there needs to be. I think that we're a mature enough country to be able to, look at what actually really happened and talk about it openly. Yeah.
What should we be thinking about in terms of the enduring meaning and legacy of Cook setting foot, do you think? Is the conversation about Cook and his arrival, or is the conversation about what his arrival signalled would happen to this continent?
I think we have to start with actually what really happened in 1770, because what's become really apparent to me, and look, I was guilty of it too, is just getting 1788 and 1770 mixed up. And really the encounters, as fleeting as they were in 1770, I mean, it's an absolutely ripping yarn. It's an amazing story. One of the biggest features, I think, of the story that I have learnt that I knew nothing about before is the fact that nearly every Aboriginal community on the east coast of Australia thought that Cook and his men were visiting ghosts, that they were the reincarnation of their ancestral totems that had come back.
Yeah, we'll come to talk a bit more about that. It's a really interesting story. Kate Darian-Smith, if I can come to you, no matter what your perspective is on Cook's landing in Botany Bay, 250 years is a significant anniversary, and you've looked at how we've marked that anniversary over the years since his arrival. We'll talk about that. How do you think we should be commemorating that event today?
Well, look, like Alison, I welcome the opportunity, I think, with that commemoration now to talk about what happened, to think through and I suppose, I'm very taken by the idea of truth-telling. What is the past about? How can we look at those stories? What do they tell us now about what contemporary Australia is? But let's not shy away from the fact that there was violence in 1770 on the beach, and let's think what it means for us now. I think too it's important to understand that Captain Cook has perhaps lost some status for very younger generations of Australians who it's very common to mix up 1770 and 1778, even with university students who are coming through and studying history. So I do think it's a moment to pause and reflect, and commemoration should be always about asking questions about the past.
Do you think it's possible to celebrate Cook's landing and the subsequent European settlement of this country without diminishing the devastating impact that had on First Nations people?
I think that looking back from our perspective right now, we can't separate out events and their implications and what happened. At the same time, I think all of us would agree that Cook as a person was a remarkable navigator, and it's a remarkable voyage for its time. But I think to actually separate out what happened at Botany Bay and what that means now is a false separation. We can't do that from our perspective.
Kate Fullagar, do you think our commemoration of Cook's landing still buys into the myths of empire and the mythology of Cook discovering Australia? I mean, which was what I was taught at primary school. How much of that mythology do you think continues to exist today at the 250th anniversary?
I think that I think it is quite strong still. You can sort of see immediately that the backlash to any kind of scholar wanting to add nuance and complexity to it is often seen to be some sort of challenge or fight, and then it's instantly kind of challenged. So I think that it still is quite a tense idea. I would just sort of join Alison and Kate in saying that it is an interesting era to think about. I am a scholar of the 18th century, so I love anyone thinking about the 18th century at all. But one thing that my research has shown that we do need to question a bit more, and this is an extension of questioning kind of the discovery kind of theme, is even the idea of him being a solo navigator. He obviously was extremely talented navigator, captain, but when he was through the Pacific, anyway, he was greatly aided by Indigenous people, helping him diplomatically, helping him, navigationally. So I'm interested in finding out how Cook operated amongst a crew of his own men and amongst islanders, which he constantly had to negotiate with, almost every day of that Endeavour voyage. And so once we think of Cook embedded in a kind of rich social context, to me he becomes more interesting.
And that's a story of Cook that so few of us are familiar with, the idea that he travelled through the Pacific with Indigenous people from the Pacific Islands. I mean, that is an almost untold story, really, isn't it?
I suppose I've noticed in the last couple of years when there were sort of quite a lot of Cook commemorations in 2018 when the Endeavour leaves Britain. So the British institutions were interested in that date more than 2020. And most institutions did try to incorporate biographies of Tupaia, who was a Raitangan islander who joined Cook's voyage when they were in the Tahitian archipelago, and therefore stayed with Cook when he headed south to Aotearoa and over to Botany Bay, and he was with Cook all the way through his journey up the Barrier Reef. And I did notice that the British Library, the British Museum, and particularly the New Zealand institutions, when they had their commemorations, were interested in him. But probably beyond the last couple of years, people haven't thought about how Cook really relied on and interacted with, in generally positive way, in terms of the islanders who joined his crew, and how important that had been.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that in a moment. It's a fascinating story. Alison, you've spoken to historians, to traditional owners, to curators, and you think that perhaps history has been a bit too unkind toward Cook, as distinct from, say, Joseph Banks. How so?
Well, I always thought Cook was the bad guy, growing up as an Indigenous woman, especially in South Sydney. Where he was the catalyst for the destruction of my people and our culture, when actually I think history has been very unfair to Cook. I think he actually comes from a working class background, and the thing that really changed my view of Cook, to be honest, Paul, was I was reading his diaries, and they're a pretty dry read, to be honest with you, except for this one entry, and I think it came from all of his experiences up and down the East Coast. As he sails off the tip of Cape York, he writes this entry, his reflection on the natives of New Holland, as being some of the happiest people on earth, that the land and sea would provide them everything they would ever need, that they live without the inequality of our condition. And it just had me I think that was a really human sort of moment for me, where I actually looked at, here's a man from Georgian England in 1770 that kind of got it. He got blackfellas. He sort of got our cultural values and where we're coming from, our connection to country. And when you do look into his encounters, especially in Cooktown, you know, our ecological connection to country and care for country would have been very obvious to him. And so that actually turned me and made me think, wow, you know, I think he was actually a decent bloke. And it is... And then I started to think, well, what about those 18 years between 1770 and 1788? You know, who made all those decisions about the fact that we would make this fantastic penal colony and, you know, we could just start sending prisoners over here and, you know, bring a vial of smallpox along and see how that would go. Those decisions weren't Cook's decisions, but, you know, Joseph Banks had a role to play in those decisions. But those 18 years, that's a very dark part of our history that none of us in Australia know anything about. And, you know, we quite possibly might want to start asking a few clarifying questions of England, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think partly because, as we've already said, there is such confusion between the arrival of Cook in 1770 when he first sets foot on Botany Bay and then the first fleet. There's a conflation of those two events in the minds of some members of the public. Just going back to that quote that you referenced though, Alison, it is, I agree, a really striking comment by Cook that the Aboriginal people, he writes, may appear to be the most wretched people on earth, but in reality they are far happier than we Europeans. It is a remarkably insightful comment from a white fella from England, a naval captain coming out, seeing a culture he's obviously completely unfamiliar with. And it does, you're saying, cast him in a different light than what you'd originally thought.
Definitely, and a lot of the communities that I collaborated with on the film that I made, which tells the story from the shore and from Aboriginal perspective, you know, it was really them that was sort of telling me that, look, here's a working class man, he had 6 kids, you know, he's a decent bloke, you know. So I think, you know, there's a lot of myth busting that needs to happen when it comes to Cook, that, you know, we do have to give him credit for actually understanding that. And if you think about it, Paul, he understood, you know, he understood a value in Aboriginal culture that really our nation is only just starting to kind of cotton onto now. And so I think he has to be credited for that.
Kate Fullagar, as you've already mentioned, Indigenous people travelled with Cook on his voyages through the Pacific, Indigenous people from the Pacific Islands, and this was including on his Endeavour voyages. Tell us a little bit more about that. How many people accompanied him and where were they from?
Well, there's quite a bit of evidence to show that islanders sort of hop on the Endeavour and his later ships to sort of go to the next island, to use him as a taxi, which I think is a great image. But Cook was generally, on principle, sort of didn't want to include a new islander in his crew, mainly because he just wanted to keep his crew cohesive. But Banks in that first voyage convinced Cook that Tupaia, who was a priest from the Tahitian archipelago, would be someone who was worth actually having on board, and he wants to go all the way to Britain and he will help us and we can help him. And Banks also had told Cook, I will be completely responsible for kind of chaperoning Tupaia and be responsible for him once we get to Britain. And on those conditions, Cook said fine. Probably by that stage, Cook had also realised that Tupaia was kind of, you know, what he would have called a Renaissance man. He seemed to know a lot about different island cultures. He seemed to know a lot about seafaring. He clearly was a very experienced kind of nautical man himself. And he just had a lot of wisdom to impart. He also understood quite a lot of English, and he also understood quite a lot of English art forms. So on that basis, Cook was, you know, he knew that this was going to be a bonus for him. So he includes Tupaia from Tahiti, and when they traverse down to Aotearoa, Tupaia actually maps all the islands that he knows around, from between Tahiti and Aotearoa. And scholars today think it does match up remarkably well to what Western cartographers have come up with. So that's kind of remarkable. There is evidence to show, well, that does suggest anyway that Tupaia himself had traversed those kind of distances in his own watercraft, or at least had heard ancestral tales about them. So he goes to Aotearoa. He makes Cook's life a lot easier when he's in Aotearoa, in terms of he can speak quite well to Maori people because they realise there's a linguistic connection. So Cook is a big beneficiary. And then he's with him in Botany Bay and then in Cooktown. Unfortunately, Tupaia is suffering what looks like scurvy in both Botany Bay and Cooktown, so he's not quite as part of the story as he'd been in Aotearoa, but he is part of it. He has a beautiful sketch of Aboriginal people from Botany Bay that he leaves us today in the records. And he did try very hard to kind of communicate with people in Cooktown, but unfortunately his ill health was a problem there. And unfortunately really gets the better of him when they move on after Cape York to Indonesia, and he dies there. So Banks doesn't get his wish and having a Pacific Islander in Britain with him. But it's from that Banks's disappointment that he couldn't get Tupaia to come all the way to Britain that he urges Cook to get another Pacific Islander on his second voyage, and that also happens then.
Okay. We've lost Kate Darian-Smith on the line from Tasmania. We're trying to get Kate back again. But Kate Fullagar, just talking about the other person that spent some time, the other Indigenous person who spent some time travelling with Cook throughout the Pacific, an islander by the name of Mai or Omai. He accompanied Cook, I understand, for the longest period of time. Who was he?
So Mai was also from Raiatea, also the island that Tupaia had come from, and both of them had been displaced by inter-Indigenous conflicts. So they both were in Tahiti when Cook encountered them. And as I've said, Tupaia had been the very kind of highly skilled priestly navigator that had gone on Cook's Endeavour voyage, but had not survived. Now, Banks was not on the second voyage, but he did tell Cook, if we could have that opportunity again, that would be great. And I would, again, chaperone anyone who came to Britain that you would wanted to bring back. So Cook knew this. So when he encountered Mai, a similar type of person in some ways to Tupaia, but he had not been a kind of high-ranking priest, then Cook allowed him to be on the adventure ship, which was on the second voyage. And Mai, very similar to Tupaia, had helped ease some diplomatic negotiations with other islanders through the Pacific. That voyage sort of skirted Australian landmass, though, when it went back to Britain. And he did go to Britain. Interestingly, there he meets Banks, who inoculates him against smallpox. It's the first thing that he does. Because there had been quite a low rate of survival of American Indians who had gone to Britain because of that one disease, and we know so much more aware of diseases and vaccines right now. So Banks, had been an early fan of inoculation, as it was called then, and Mai survives it, and so he survives the whole 2 years in Britain as well, and then goes back to Tahiti or to the Tahitian archipelago with Cook's third voyage. So spends, gets to know Cook very well. Cook gets to know him very well too.
So he spends 2 years in England.
That's right. And because, partly because of who he is, he's kind of someone that is the first Pacific Islander to ever be in Britain, so he causes his own splash. But because he's so associated with Banks, who's a bit of a playboy kind of superstar in Britain himself, then he does amass a lot of attention. He meets the king, he hangs out with kind of high society set, which in that case includes people like Edmund Burke and Samuel Johnson. Because of this situation, because he must have been a very adventurous, kind of brave person to have done this kind of journey, also learns a lot of skills, including English. He survives for 2 years. Interestingly, a lot of scholars who are interested in Mai have mostly thought of him, like 18th century British people probably thought of him, as a kind of exotic story, which can be a fruitful kind of window onto 18th century life. But really looking at it from Mai's perspective, which I think scholars haven't done so much, it's really about kind of a fact-finding mission for Mai, and possibly an arms-finding mission, because a bit like Tupaia, his main interest is back in Raiatea. that island that had been usurped by other islanders, and he wanted to think maybe I could get these British people's arms, these ghostly arms, because they seem reasonably effective, and I could amass them for my own Indigenous story. And so what I've been interested mostly is thinking about Tupaia and Maya's perspective on these voyages from their own Indigenous background. Their own motivations were about their own island contexts. They weren't necessarily interested in, being great global navigators or being, discoverers with a capital D. They had other motivations, and history becomes so much more complex and interesting when we can think about the multiple motivations and contexts going on at the same time.
Well, you can see what Cook would gain from travelling with Indigenous people from the Pacific who, as you say, know the oceans, can act as interpreters, can introduce them to other islanders. It makes it much easier for Cook. In fact, it makes them almost indispensable, in fact, for Cook and co. But I was interested in what their agenda was as Indigenous people. Was there something in particular? Was there some thing that they were trying to achieve by using Cook, if you like, to allow them to further their own ambitions?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think both of them, because they come from Raiatea, and Raiatea is in a very tricky situation in the 1760s to right through to the rest of the 18th century, because it's been taken over by Bora Borans. And so I think both of those travellers on the two different voyages are mostly motivated to think about what could you take from the British Empire to aid one's own personal kind of restitution efforts. On top of that, though, I think it's quite clear that Tupaia has so much navigational knowledge and is such a revered person, particularly when he goes to Aotearoa, that he probably also has an agenda of traversing the Pacific again, as he probably has done, and so kind of adding on to his expertise in Pacific travel. For Mai, who had certainly island hopped around the archipelago, he may not have ventured beyond the archipelago, but his ancestry, of course, is steeped in long voyage settlements. That is how the Pacific is settled, and he knows that coming from a sacred island of Raiatea, which is seen to be a very central island in that history. To hop on board a craft and to commit to going to extremely long distance is part of his ancestral background. So it may have been a once-in-a-lifetime epic kind of going to the moon kind of scenario for British people. It's interesting to think that for Pacific Islanders, crossing an entire ocean is just naturally part of their history. So it jolts our perspective to think of it in these two different ways at the same time.
Yeah, and Alison, it jolts our perspective of Cook too. I mean, I don't know how much you were aware of this, of Cook travelling throughout the Pacific with Pacific Islanders, Indigenous Pacific Islanders. It's news to me. Is it something that you're aware of? Does it perhaps gel with your idea that Cook is a bit more of a complex figure than we've come to think of him as?
Well, it sounds to me, I didn't know any of those stories, Kate, and it just sounds to me like, he obviously really opened his mind and learnt a lot over those different voyages, because, I think the great shame, about what happened in Australia in 1770 is, Cook was mapping a country that was already mapped, and he was naming places that were already named, and he brought with him a scientific vessel that was about to collide with a system of trial and error and observation that is traditional knowledge, that, is the reason why Aboriginal people were so successful here for so many thousands of years. And so if I could go and stand back on the beach with him, it would have been amazing to have the true meeting of minds, that, would make Australia a very different place today, I'm sure.
Kate Darian-Smith,
But, that's a journey of learning that I think he embarked on, but, with his untimely death.
Yeah, Kate Darian-Smith, if I can bring you back into the discussion. You've been looking at the history of how we've commemorated Cook's arrival here, and we have indeed been commemorating it for, well over a century, in fact. But a theme, it would seem, of the past commemorations have been very much about reinforcing some of those imperial British narratives and the narrative too that Cook peacefully claimed the continent. Would that be a fair assessment of how we've commemorated his arrival in the past? And I'm also curious about when that started to be challenged.
Yes, look, I think that what's very interesting to me is that Cook's arrival was commemorated as early as 1822 when a plaque was erected at Cornell. So there's very much a sense, this is only a few decades afterwards of how significant that event was. And throughout the 19th century, there are reenactments and commemorations. We have to remember too that Arthur Phillip's arrival in 1788, coming with the first fleet, was an arrival of convicts. So by the mid-19th century, going into the late 19th century, the convict stain is something to be shirked at for respectable white Australians. And so Cook becomes a more acceptable feature there, a more acceptable character. And there's big commemorations of Cook happening with such events as in the 1888 Centennial Federation and going right into the 20th century. But they were also, there were disputes in particular, and there were protests that were certainly happening, particularly in the 20th century. In 1970, which was the bicentenary of Captain Cook's landing, Australia and other parts of the world seemed to go crazy with a kind of Cook mania. And there were a lot of commemorations or pageants to mark Cook's arrival right around Australia, not just at the coast. And the Queen came along, and at Botany Bay, there was a big commemoration and a reenactment of what had happened on the beach. And what was important about that 1917 commemoration was that this was a fully televised event and quite dramatic. And I think that image of Cook walking up the beach, putting his hand out, becomes one that is very much associated with a performative part of those reenactments. But in 1970, the so-called celebration of Cook was also marked by Indigenous protest. Across the bay at La Perouse, there was a gathering of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, and they released funeral wreaths into the sea and had their own event, very much in the style of a day of mourning that had been the way in which some of those earlier commemorations had also been marked. So I think important to acknowledge that while there have been reenactments and commemorations, certainly in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, they've been openly challenged. And again, to return to that issue about thinking about Cook now in 2020, we need to think about the complexity of the stories and the different ways in which that arrival in 1770 is remembered and commemorated and challenged, I think.
Have we deliberately airbrushed out of the story, though, some of the less convenient parts of it, like the fact, for example, which I don't think we've mentioned so far, that Cook actually shot at Indigenous people upon his arrival?
Yes, look, I think in those reenactment events and certainly in the narratives and the stories about Cook that were taught in schools, there's no mention of the violence that occurred on the beach at Botany Bay. Cook himself, as he recorded in his journals, did take his gun and did shoot at Aboriginal people, two men coming forward. there was a violent encounter, and a shield that was held up by one of the men, which now sits in the British Museum, does have the marks of the bullet that was fired. So I think, yes, it's very much a particular story. It's also a story of, I think, comes to be told in broad terms around Cook very much as a peacemaker, coming forward, offering his hand and putting that up in peace, but also very much a story of imperial possession. This is Britain coming to Australia, and certainly the idea of Cook putting up a flag, which is often depicted in earlier reenactments as actually happening at Botany Bay, putting up the flag on behalf of Britain. So linked to the claiming of Australia for the British Empire.
Just a final question before we leave this issue of how we've commemorated Cook. It's not a great line that we've got you on, but just one question more. In 1951, which was the kind of half century of Australian Federation, there was some interest in having commemoration of Cook arriving in 1770, but interest and enthusiasm in Cook around that time was at such a low ebb that formalities were abandoned. Had Cook become a rather less interesting or persona non grata in that period, and if so, why?
Look, I think it's really that there was just other things happening. This is a period in the 50s. There was less interest in commemorating that Cook's arrival, because this is a time when Australia is moving out of the Second World War. It's rebuilding, it's looking to modernise, it's looking forward. And so I think the lack of interest, which, really occurred in the 50s and 60s about Cook, is because the Australian nation is looking to a different kind of Australia ahead. In 1970, because there are commemorations of the voyage around the world, and because the Queen, it's a big deal. She comes out to Australia for that date, and I think that reinvigorates the interest in Cook. But commemorations of the past are always about, to some extent, what people are thinking about now in the present. And there was certainly that lull in the mid-20th century.
Yeah. Alison, not long ago you visited Cape York and spoke with Indigenous people and elders there, including one man who sung a song composed by his ancestors when Cook arrived in Possession Island in the Torres Strait in 1770. Tell us about that and what that song was about. It sounds like a rather moving moment.
Oh, it was definitely a moving moment. This is Uncle Tommy Savage, who's one of the traditional owners there, and it was a song called Merkai Uncle, which translates as Ghostship, which is, how they viewed this ship coming. That was the message that was sent up the coast, that there was this vessel of dead people arriving. And the song, it's a really sad song. And I was recording it on the beach, just in this makeshift recording studio, holding a piece of core flute. And he told me that the translation was that we must put our system away. We've got to put everything about our knowledge away while this ship is here, which was sort of really sad. I said to him when we stopped recording, I said, well, it's time to get it back out, Uncle Savage. We want the whole nation and the whole world wants to hear about this Indigenous system. So it's safe to bring it out now.
So the Endeavour was working its way up the east coast toward Cape York, and basically the Indigenous people on the shore saw this as a boat full of ghosts. Not only that, they were communicating it to other tribes up the coast. How were they doing that?
Well, it would have been, I mean, you know, even Banks and Cook record a lot of smoke that they see as they're travelling up, fires that are lit. I mean, it would have been early dry season. There would have been backburning happening as well, but there were definite smoke signals. And when you look into the science behind those smoke signals, I mean, the messages are so intricate about, you know, Uncle Johnny's cousin's sick and he's got this wrong with him. I mean, it's incredible how much detail was passed on, but it would have also been through message sticks that were sent by very young, fit men who were chosen to run up the coast as well. But of course, to warn about these ghostly arrivals.
You've included that story and that song in a film that you've made for the National Museum of Australia to commemorate 250 years of Cook. The film's called The Message. Just give us an idea about that.
Oh, I was so lucky to have the opportunity to co-create really with the descendants of the people whose ancestors encountered Cook, to put together the story from the shore, really, which, you know, to me is amazing, Paul, that here we are in 2020, it's 250 years, and still we've never heard one side of the story, and that's the story from Indigenous people, and which is really amazing, like the two warriors that met Captain Cook at Kamay in Botany Bay. They're standing there and they're saying, "Warra warra wah, warra warra wah," which when you read on the plaque at the landing place, it's always been said that translates as "go away," you know, which was probably, you know, it makes sense that they deduced that because Cook himself in his diary says all they seem to want is for us to be gone. So he felt the vibe that they didn't really want him there. But Warra warra wah translates in Dharawal language as the dead, these people are dead. So these warriors would have been yelling out to their own mob who are up in the bush to say, here are these ghosts, these people are dead, which is why when Cook and Banks, you know, they spend 8 days in Kamay and they're trying to give gifts, you know, because Cook's orders, he had to get permission. But they literally ghosted Cook and Banks, you know. They tried several times to make friends, but they just got ignored. And that story continues all the way up the coast. And to me, that's absolutely amazing. I mean, I didn't even know, I call myself a concrete Koori, Paul. Like, I grew up in the middle of the city. I didn't really know anything about our beliefs about reincarnation, and I don't think any Australians do. But when you start to hear the story from the shore and how the perspective of Indigenous people, like when Cook and Banks catch 12 female turtles in Cooktown, and the Guguyamatha people are so angry about it, and they surround Cook and his men and they light a big fire. I mean, think about that. That's a climate protest. That's environmental action going on in Australia in 1770. And to me, that is something that this country should just be so proud of and embrace and be teaching to all of our kids. I went into my kids' Year 3 class last year because it's on the Year 3 curriculum. And when I told that story and I mentioned about the female turtles during breeding season, I mean, there was an audible gasp. You know, the kids today, they get it. And so I think that's, you know, why we shouldn't shy away from our history. Our history shouldn't be seen as a dirty little secret that we can, you know, like the black armband view of history that Howard used to talk about. I mean, I think we're a mature enough country to really look at it because it's not our fault.
Yeah. When I was last speaking to Stan Grant about Australia Day, we had a really interesting conversation, surprising conversation. He said to me, you know, of that time in the late 18th century, it was inevitable, Stan said to me, that the world was coming to Australia. It was inevitable that the way of life that Indigenous First Nations people were living in Australia would be disrupted. He said that is not to take away from the devastation that was wrought by colonisation, but he said there is a bigger, more complex story here. It is a story about Cook bringing Enlightenment values to Australia, but it's also a story of the beginning of the end of a way of life as well. Is Cook's legacy more complicated than perhaps we've been wanting to admit, because it is overshadowed by this terrible devastation for First Nations peoples? And how do we find a way in to having that conversation? I feel even uncomfortable talking about it now because I don't in any way want to diminish the terrible tragedy that occurred after Cook. Is there a way, I suppose, is the question I'm asking, of having a nuanced, complex discussion about Cook?
Yeah, look, to be honest with you, if the government didn't have, want to commemorate Cook so badly for the 250th anniversary, then I certainly wouldn't have been commissioned to make a film that tells the story from the shore. The National Museum wouldn't have been able to be resourced to go around and collect these stories. So we might be sitting here, for another 50 years not knowing the history. So I do believe that we do need to resource Indigenous people more to tell their stories, because I think that what's in it for all Australians, it's not just about the truth, which I think is really important and is a really fascinating story, and is, whilst there are really dark chapters in it, and I really believe that we have the maturity to face that. I think the conversation that comes after that sort of period of healing is, I think we're able to take the best of Western science and the best of traditional knowledge and start to design a future for ourselves that starts to kind of see ourselves as a truly ancient nation, instead of acting like, the little brother or sister of England and America. Like, I'm really over that, because I just think, no, we have survived on this country for thousands of years, and all Australians should embrace that as part of their heritage. And I think we do have that opportunity to kind of take the best of both worlds and move forward.
Kate Fullagar, part of the story that you tell of Cook's travels with Indigenous people from the Pacific Islands is a story of, ultimately in the end, Cook betraying at least one of those Indigenous people, of not fulfilling a promise that he thought Cook would fulfil. Setting that aside though, do you think it is true, as Alison said earlier, that Cook did come to understand Indigenous cultures profoundly, understand and even perhaps learn from their culture and belief system, or did he remain really till the end a kind of British colonist?
That's a great question. I do think that he was genuinely interested in Islander cultures anyway. I can't speak so much for Australian Aboriginal cultures, but he definitely learnt a lot, and he learned a lot of languages actually too, and he learnt a lot of knowledges, which went hand in hand for him though with quite a lot of dramatic violence, and particularly was his downfall in Hawaii. And I don't think there's any, we shouldn't forget that kind of violence that he oversaw, and which got worse and worse through the three voyages. But surely, that is, I'm fascinated by Stan Grant's characterisation of the Enlightenment ideas that Cook was also embodying, which is true, which therefore includes good and bad. One thing that Cook would have expected himself, having been a veteran of North American conflict, and also what Arthur Phillip would have expected, having also been a veteran of North America, is both of them would have expected, as part of Enlightenment values, to bring a treaty and to have to sign a treaty before you could claim ownership, because that's what had happened in the New World of America. So it's interesting that some of the things that someone like Stan Grant would presumably decry, which is the lack of treaty in this country is in many ways a post-Enlightenment failure. And it is not actually to do with the 18th century. If you really absorb the 18th century context of Cook and even Phillip, things actually, the colonisation, what Grant says is perhaps the inevitable globalisation of the world in the 18th century, could have gone a bit better. And delving into that history kind of shows us these alternative pathways.
Oh, yes. I know, mate, I don't want a verbal stand, but I'm sure he would agree with that characterisation. Kate Darian-Smith, if I can just perhaps wrap up with you. A replica of Cook's ship, the Endeavour, was to have circumnavigated Australia as part of the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the voyage. That expensive reenactment actually has been cancelled because of coronavirus. But it was to have been an historically inaccurate reenactment from what I can tell, because the Endeavour never actually circumvented Australia.
No, look, of course not. And actually, to call that a reenactment is historically untrue. But what was, I think, the intent there was to visit Australia in many places, including starting in Tasmania, to really commemorate the 250. I think we've lost a bit of an opportunity for what might have happened in this kind of voyage 250 years later, going to places where Cook hadn't gone. Because I think that actual act may have led to more complex stories and different narratives. And we've heard some today, the view from the shore. We've also heard about the fact that Cook went with people from the Pacific back to Britain. So there are different voyages. And I think that, there are great opportunities to really enrich the story of Cook, to think about different kinds of histories and from different perspectives. And whether it's a reenactment or not, and this certainly wasn't, there's the opportunity to think about how we can reflect on those histories now and take them forward.
It's been great talking to all three of you. Fantastic conversation. I want to thank Kate Fullagar from the Macquarie University, Alison Page, and Kate Darian-Smith from the University of Tasmania for speaking with us today. Thanks also to the State Library of Queensland and to The Conversation. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye.